Hello, my name is Dr. Katie Lynch, and I am an English professor at Rockland Community College in the State University of New York System. It is March 25th, 2020, and we are currently in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. I hope you and your families are all safe and well. And what's happening with my classes is that I will need to teach them using a distance learning format. And so as part of that work and preparation, I am putting some videos up online about a poem that we are reading in both College Writing 2 honors and in Epic Literature honors, the two courses I'm teaching this semester. And that poem is John Milton's Paradise Lost, an epic poem about the fall of Adam and Eve. It is a very incredibly difficult poem, but it is an incredibly beautiful and powerful poem. And so these videos, these sort of mini lectures, will hopefully give you some tools to sort of use as you read through the poem. So this is directed both at my own students and at anybody else who stumbles across this on YouTube. I hope it's useful to you. You can let me know in the comments. So I want to start first by briefly introducing myself and then going on to introduce Milton and how I will be engaging with his poem. So I received my Bachelor's of Arts in English and in History from Dartmouth College in 2002, and then I went on to take my PhD from the University of Madison in 2010 in Literary Studies. My area of expertise is medieval English literature. However, during graduate school, I took several courses in early modern literature and one entire course on Milton. And I really think that that's kind of the second place where I fell in love with Paradise Lost. The first place I fell in love with Paradise Lost was actually while studying at Oxford during my undergraduate time. I did a study abroad there, and I was fortunate enough to do a one-on-one tutorial with Professor Jonathan Wordsworth, who is, I believe, the great-great-great-grandnephew of the poet William Wordsworth. And Professor Wordsworth, had me over to his flat in the afternoons each week, and we would talk about Paradise Lost. My understanding of the poem was so rudimentary. I'm a little embarrassed to think about it now. But so I have studied this poem several different times with several different kinds of experts. I have also taught the poem numerous times. So even though it is not in my particular area of expertise, my hope is that you can trust me to tell you a little bit about the poem and how it works and what it's trying to say. I will do my very best to distinguish between fact and fiction. So there are certain facts about the poem, such as when it was written, how it was published, when Milton is using an epic simile. But then, of course, there are many, many different interpretations of what is going on. And so you'll be receiving both the facts about the poem and some of my own interpretations. I'll do my best to signal those when they come up. In terms of how we are going to interact with the poem, what the site you see before you is the Milton Reading Room hosted by my alma mater, Dartmouth College. This is the product of Thomas Luxon, a professor of early modern English there, and many of his students, myself included. So if you are, here on the site and you go up and you sort of take a peek at the very beginning of the page, the home screen here, and you click on More. What you'll see is a little bit about the reading room. I'm not going to go through this, but my name is here, so just to tell you, I'm not lying. I did participate in this project, and the idea that Professor Luxon had for this project was to make it possible for people to read Paradise Lost with a very rich body of annotations, and also to interact with many, many other works of Milton. In fact, his entire corpus is up here, which is really impressive. All annotated, all hyperlinked. There are a whole bunch of sources that you can look at here near the bottom of the page. If you see here selected criticism, you can go and check out various literary critics that have written about Milton. There are other research links. So for example, if we click on Milton sites here, you'll see a biography of Milton from the Poetry Foundation and several other sites. So this is just a very, very rich site about Milton and his work, and that's what I'll be using to read the poem. So if we go over here and we click on Paradise Lost, what you'll see is that I'm immediately taken to book one. It'd probably be best for you, if you have never interacted with the poem before, to read the introduction. It is a very readable but also very insightful introduction, and it includes all kinds of important information that will help you understand the poem. In this introductory mini lecture, I just want to sort of conclude by saying a little bit about the poet himself, and then in subsequent lectures I will tackle each book of the poem in turn. So first of all, Milton was born in 1608. And he did overlap with Shakespeare by a few years, but Shakespeare died when Milton was still a child, so they never knew each other. But recent evidence has come to light by some academics working with each other through Twitter, if you can believe that, where we believe we've discovered Milton's copy of the first folio of Shakespeare, and he actually annotated it in some very interesting ways. And I'll put a link to that article. But so Milton knew Shakespeare's works, but he did not know Shakespeare personally. And I just mention that because these are two of the pretty much the heaviest hitters in the English literary canon. And so it's important to know kind of how their lives linked up. They never met, but they were, of course, both Englishmen, and they were both writing works inspired by a variety of source material. And I'll say a lot more about that later when we get into Paradise Lost. Milton matriculated at Cambridge University, at Christ College, Cambridge, when he was 16 years old, and he wrapped up both his bachelor's and his master's in 7 years there. There is evidence that he had a disagreement with his very first tutor, or his very first sort of supervising professor. We're not sure exactly what happened, but they definitely had a disagreement, and Milton was rusticated for a time, meaning he was sent away from Cambridge. And I mention this anecdote because it shows you that Milton was unafraid to express his mind, and that is one of his defining characteristics, both in his poetry and in his life, and also in his prose as well, certainly. In 1638, he went on a grand tour, so this is sort of like taking a gap year. He toured France, he spent so much time in Italy, he even met Galileo. So Galileo was very old and also blind at that point. He was under house arrest still, although it was really a formality at that point. But the reason I mention Galileo is because there are several specific references to Galileo in Paradise Lost. We'll call those out when we come to them, but Galileo clearly left a mark on Milton. He returned to England in 1639, and just so you're aware of what was going on in England, the tension between the king and the parliament was really heating up at this point, bordering on civil war. In 1642, Milton got very suddenly married, and within a few months of him getting married, his wife sort of left the home and returned to her family for quite some time, for years. And this led Milton to actually write a treatise in favor of divorce, which he published, and which was highly controversial in his time. So the divorce tracts, as they're known, he was an early proponent of divorce, just simply on the grounds of, not sort of believing the same kinds of things, or not having the same kinds of priorities, not for any sort of special exemplary reason. And so he was quite a revolutionary in that respect. So then we come to the period of the civil wars in England, and Milton, after the Parliament and the king fought several battles, and the king was ultimately captured and beheaded by the parliamentary forces led by Oliver Cromwell, Milton did write a pamphlet, a tract known as the Tenure of Kings and Magistrates. And he wrote that in 1649, or 1648, excuse me, and that tract really brought him to the attention of the people in England who were in charge, so Cromwell and his associates. And as a result, they made Milton the Secretary of Foreign Tongues. So essentially, he was corresponding on behalf of England with other countries, mostly in Europe, and he was doing that in Latin. He was incredibly good at writing in Latin and, of course, reading Latin. But Milton also knew many, many other languages, including Hebrew, Greek. Obviously he knew English very well, German and French, and so he was very much a polyglot and very well versed in reading and writing in these languages. Milton is probably one of the most educated people that ever lived in the world, and I really do not mince words when I say that. I mean it. He was highly, highly educated. And so during the course of the Protectorate, and that whole era in English history, Milton served as the Secretary of Foreign Tongues. He did require assistance as he began to go blind, but his tenure in that position lasted pretty much through the rest of the Protectorate itself. And unfortunately for Milton, the Restoration was what happened next. So the king Charles I was beheaded, of course, but his son Charles II, who had flown to France, he ended up being restored in 1660. And at that particular point, Milton had to go into hiding because he was in danger of being executed for his crimes against the monarchy. Fortunately, his life was spared with the help of his friends, most notably the poet Andrew Marvell. And so Milton was allowed to, he was pardoned, he was part of the general pardon, and he was allowed to remain living, but he had to sort of abandon, any kind of public office, of course. He was not a part of the Restoration government at all. And so he kind of retired from public life, but he did not at all retire from writing. And this is the period of his greatest poetic production. In earlier parts of his life, when he was younger, he did write some poetry, and examples of that are here. So I'm just going to click around a little bit. The poem 1645, you can see a lot of his earlier works. Lycidas is a beautiful elegy written for one of his friends who passed away. He wrote many sonnets. These are his English works, but he also wrote many Latin works as well. And so you can also click on the 1673 poems, which were written later in his life. But to get a sense of what he was doing earlier, you want to look at 1645. But when he was working in an official capacity for the Protectorate, he was mostly writing prose. And I also want to let you know that you can find his prose, not all of it, but most of it. It is here. So Areopagitica, for example, is a very, very famous tract in favor of free speech. The Doctrine and Discipline of Divorce I've mentioned previously. The Tenure of Kings and Magistrates is the defense that he wrote of the arrest and beheading of King Charles I. There are many, I could say a lot more about other prose texts that Milton has written, but we will not do that today. We'll focus back again on Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost was first published in 1667. Initially, it was published in 10 books, and later Milton reorganized the poem and published it in 12 books. And then Milton passed away in 1674, but not before also writing, and I'll scroll down here, Paradise Regained, which is a shorter sequel to Paradise Lost, and also the play Samson Agonistes. And so his later life, while he was blind, it was a period of intense production for him in terms of poetry. He would often dictate, he couldn't write, so he would dictate to an amanuensis, a scribe. Those people would be his friends, his daughters as well. He used his daughters as scribes. And so he was composing this poetry in his mind and then dictating it, and other people were writing it down for him. A truly, incredible mind to be able to do that work, even though he is blind at that time. And so as I close out our very first introductory video here, just a couple things to know about Paradise Lost specifically. The poem is an epic. Okay, and so it is conceived as very much a response to other epics, other classical epics, such as Homer's Iliad and Odyssey and Virgil's Aeneid. There are copious references to all three of those texts in Milton's epic. It is organized in many ways along the same lines as those classical epics. I'll say a lot more about that when we're looking into Book 1 especially, but all of the books are heavily indebted to the epics. And when you think about Milton reorganizing the poem into 12 books, one potential reason for that is that 12 is half of 24, and 24 is the number of books in the Homeric Iliad and Odyssey. And so Milton may have been sort of interested in a number of books that sort of corresponds to 24 in some way. 12 is also a very important number for Christianity, and there are 12 disciples of Jesus, for example, 12 tribes of Israel in the Christian Old Testament. And that's the final thing I want to say about Milton, is that he is a very, very deep and profound Christian. He absolutely believed in the Christian God, and specifically the Protestant God. He did not like Roman Catholics at all, but he also did not like Anglicanism. He did not like the Church of England and the church that was, the church overseeing everything in England at the time when he was alive. In fact, he went to Cambridge to study to become a minister, but he ended up seeing too much corruption in the English church, and so he decided not to join it, very deliberately not to join it. By the end of his life, Milton was never attending a church. There was not a church that he wanted to attend, but he had very firm private beliefs about God, and he believed that a person could worship God privately, and that was just as valuable, if not more so, than worshiping God publicly. So he really did believe in a deep individual relationship with God. And if you had to describe his faith, it would be more Puritan than anything else. But again, he never wholly subscribed to any one particular way of thinking about God. His way was his way. And you're going to learn a lot about that in Paradise Lost itself. So I will close this video for now. Thanks very much for watching. And I will leave my information, my contact information in the description of the video. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions.